Hey, it's Sam, and I'm going to keep talking about the main things that you need to focus on to study and to learn Vedic astrology properly. You know, one of the main things I see now is just so much disarray with people studying. And the example that I use, and it's a good one, is we take this approach of digging a bunch of very small holes on the surface and thinking that we're going to strike water. In order to hit water, like if you want to dig a well to hit the water, then you need to be focusing on one deep, strong path rather than jumping around to a bunch of, different paths, digging these little holes, which the analogy is gathering information, not going really deeply into it, and thinking that it's going to really deliver a deep interpretation. It's not. It's just like jumping around and digging a bunch of little holes. So what my students have done, those who have gotten my certification course and those who have really excelled that I've seen, have taken that same amount of energy, and instead of digging 15 little holes, they are taking the same energy and just going deeper and deeper and deeper into system that works. And that's what I'm outlining today. And in the recent videos that I've made about, what is astrology and the most important things like being aligned with the light, not with the darkness, and also the need to understand Indian culture. These are the primary things that you first need to understand, because your astrology practice is going to first be reflective of what you think astrology is. And as I said in an earlier video, astrology is the study of how spirit takes form. It's clearly laid out in Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra. The planets are the visible form of Lord Vishnu, and then the invisible form is the zodiac. It's very clear that our karmas come from the divine universe and through the agency of the planets, and astrology is the study of that. But then we have to realize that these are all beings of light, and your approach to astrology as the study of light and introducing light into your life rather than this fear of darkness. Some people take that premise, or they don't even know that that's the point of astrology, but to them, astrology is a way to avoid the pain, avoid the problems. Don't show your chart, be scared, be worried. Again, one of the most important things, or the most important focus of astrology, is also focus of your life. Is your life focused on being afraid of the dark or spreading the light? And again, they are different, and you are making a choice. You are making a choice and cooperating with one world vision or another. One vision of existence, one part of yourself or another. Either that part that's trying to be, trying to avoid pain and difficulty, or one who is trying to spread light. And I'm not judging, because we all have a mixture of both. But again, I invite you to step into the light and see astrology as Jyotish, as the spreading of light. And then from there, the next thing that you need to understand to do Vedic astrology well is an understanding of Indian culture, Indian energetics. Things like yoga and this approach to what's called Sanatana Dharma. I recently did a video on that says, relative to how well you understand Sanatana Dharma, you will be able to actually practice Vedic astrology. Otherwise, you can do Western astrology. It still works very well. But Vedic astrology is based on Vedic principles. And those Vedic principles are very deep, and they're universal to all Vedic sciences and metaphysical practices of all traditions. And so relative to how well you understand things that are related to Indian, cosmology and energetics and metaphysics, will you be able to actually practice Vedic astrology? Because again, so many subtleties are worked into astrology, particularly by the Rishi Parashara, which is what I'm going to talk about today in great depth. I'm going to explain why Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra is really the main text that most serious Vedic astrology teachers focus on, because it's a sort of compendium of those principles over and over again being shown astrologically. So again, when people don't really understand Vedic culture and thinking and Sanatana Dharma and yoga and all of that so well, then they wind up looking at all these texts. Well, this one says that, this one says that, this one says that, so who knows? Well, once you examine Parashara, Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra, you can see very clearly that it was written by a Rishi. Now, without getting too much into the history of Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra, it was lost for thousands of years and it was recompiled at the end of the 19th century and all of those things. So it's gone through a lot of revisions, at least certain sections have. We can tell because the reason we can tell mainly is because certain sections of Parashara read so different than every other section, and they read like those other texts from the medieval times. And so the most important point is that Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra is not a text like any other in that it's not explanatory. It's not trying to explain to you how to do astrology. It's telling you how it works. It says, do this, do that. This means this means that. Here's how you calculate this, here's how you calculate that. It's really a lot of calculations, and it tells you what things mean. It doesn't tell you how to organize that information. It doesn't tell you any techniques, really. There are no techniques in it. It tells you when things happen. Like it says, an angle lord in a trinal house forms a Raja Yoga. An angle lord aspecting a trinal lord, or joined, or whatever. It gives rules. It doesn't tell you what Raja Yoga means, what the word means. Now, it explains earlier why it's important, but again, it doesn't explain like I explain what a Raja Yoga is and why it works and how it works. It just tells you what it is. And if you don't know what it is, then you don't know how to do astrology. It's not trying to convince anyone. It's not persuasive. It's not trying to show you how to read charts. Again, this is very different than the later texts, very different than the medieval texts. Now, it explains things, but it basically tells you what something is. Sun is the king, Moon is the queen, Mars is the general, Mercury is the crown prince, Saturn is the laborer, Jupiter is the minister, etc. And Venus is also a Brahmin. But it doesn't tell you how to interpret that. You have to find other things other places. And again, this is different than later texts, which are very explanatory. They'll say, if you see this, if you see the ruler of the third house joined Rahu and a retrograde planet, it means your brother will, fall off a building and break his ankle or whatever. So it tells you all these interpretations. Now, I realize there are parts in what we call Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra that have those kinds of sections. And those are the parts that are somewhat suspect. Again, maybe that's actually part of the original Parashara, but those are the things that myself and others that I know, those are the sections that seem suspect because it reads very different than the rest of it. The rest of it is just rules. And learn these rules and you can do astrology. Don't learn these rules and you can't. Unlike other texts which get into this endless permutation of combinations that you can never memorize, and you don't need to memorize because if you understand the rules, then you know how to do it. So again, this is a big reason why in my practice, my practice and my teaching practice, which includes, in my certification course and what I teach and what I learn, or, what I've learned, I've just taken like it's about 15 or 20 principles from Parashara and just gone deeply into them. I'm not saying techniques, I'm saying principles, because principles are upstream from techniques, okay? Gravity is a principle. Acceleration is a principle. Motion, heat is a principle. Time is a principle. You can't change them. And you can't make any technique work without understanding the principles that are above them. As it relates to something like Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra, it talks on this level of principle and framework like almost exclusively. For instance, Vedic principles are, karma is a framework. Dharma is a framework. The 5 elements are frameworks. The gunas are frameworks. Things like the caste is a framework. And other principles, the planets themselves are frameworks. But what Parashara does is it works on this level of frameworks and then shows you the rules of how they work separately, and then once you have a lot of experience with both research and with life, and you know what these things mean together, then you can fit them together to create really powerful structures, and that's where all the techniques come from anyway. So in other words, instead of memorizing these endless permutations from like you see in the other texts, once you learn the frameworks, you already know that the third lord with Rahu retrograde will show your brother falls off the building and breaks his ankle or whatever. You don't need to try to memorize these details. So again, it's analogous, like I said, to digging that well deep and understanding the principles and the frameworks. And this is why I don't chase all of these other techniques. I've done them all, practiced them all, and I'm not saying they don't work. What I'm saying though is that years ago, when I started studying astrology, I saw the same thing that most astrology students see. They had, all of these techniques, like Shadbala shows this, and there's a good part of it and the bad part. All right, low Shadbala, bad. Okay. And there's this sort of collection of good and bad things. Retrograde is bad, but sometimes it's good, so... exalted is bad. Exalted is good, but if it's retrograde, it makes it bad. And it's just all of this stuff that's disconnected from the principles. And again, the thing to understand is that once you learn the principles, and there's several that are really important. Again, the universal Vedic principles start with, the elements, the gunas. They're very important because they start from the very beginning in Sankhya philosophy. Once spirit, Purusha, becomes form, Prakriti, and separates, which means once you incarnate with karma, what happens on the soul level is this is Purusha becoming Prakriti. This is spirit taking form. The first thing that happens after spirit takes form is it separates form into the three qualities of nature. 3 gunas, and then 5 elements break out. This is why you hear me talk so much about 3 qualities, 3 gunas, and 5 elements. It's not just because I don't have anything else to say. It's because it's foundational and fundamental to everything in existence. And the higher up you go into something, and the more leverage you get around a universal principle like gunas and elements, the more everything else is going to change that comes later on. If you don't understand just what makes everything, again, not just astrologically, but in not just Vedic thinking either, but in universal, this is a universal framework that applies no matter what you're talking about. And it's even in every science. But once you understand that and go deep, deeply and more deeply and more deeply, everything else starts to change. Afterward. So if you did nothing else with your astrology studies, but just focused on all of that, let's say even for the next year, like people do in my certification course, I already have a lot of people signed up, just focusing on and really learning how all of that has so much power, you wouldn't believe how much more simple and deep everything else becomes. And again, it's not just that, that's just the beginning. But, all of the other things like the caste, that's a deep principle. It's not just part of some archaic thing from India. It's a system, these are principles at play. The 4 Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. This is a deep structure that permeates all the astrology houses in particular. And then the evolution of consciousness through body, mind, spirit, or 3 gunas. Again, these are deep principles, and what you start doing is principle stacking. Once you get into principle stacking, then you see the power of what's in Parashara. And then you start applying that to, for instance, Raja Yogas. Yogas show the results. Once you start looking at how the planets are not just these forces on the level of Karaka, which means indicator, but they also produce specific things when they activate their karmic nature. So for instance, Venus is the Karaka of relationship. It shows the shared karma we all have with it. So the planet as a karaka shows the shared thing that we all have in common. We all have a relationship thing in common, which is related to Venus. But every being experiences it differently based on what Venus rules first, and then based on how it's disposed in that natal chart. But again, this is a very deep principle that's not understood anywhere near the importance or given the importance that it needs. And in Parashara, you see it's exactly given the right weight. And that is the planet as a house ruler. It's not just some other thing to consider. And again, I see this constantly with students. Even with my students, even after years of studying with me, I have to remind them, this is not just another attribute. The planet as a house ruler is foundational to its nature, not just another detail. So, and this is in Parashara, because everything that has to do with producing results, which have to do with yogas, comes from what the planet rules, not where the planet goes, and not what the planet is as a karaka. Those things are actually, they're not completely separate, because as a karaka, Venus is going to produce a relationship with others that gets us on a trajectory of mutual respect and value. But as a house ruler and how it does it, it's completely different for every ascendant. Venus for Gemini is completely different than Venus for Leo, Venus for Taurus, Venus for Sagittarius. They're almost like not even the same energy. So again, you see this fundamental principle. This is so much more important than anything that has to do with chasing some little technique in the Navamsha, or what about this, and all this stuff people always throw at me. This is so much more important. Like, and again, this is why we study Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra, because you see in the words of the Rishi how much weight he gives these things. And there's, I said, about 15 or 20 major important principles that also migrate into everything that has to do with astrology. It's not just in this one example, it's not just this one use. It also translates into the planet as it moves through the sky and the person's relationship with it. It translates into every harmonic chart, everything you look at before you start doing something very granular and very, microbial. These fundamental principles need to be understood. So again, the reason we study Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra is it's so much different than every other text in that regard. And I'm not going to say the names of the other texts because I don't want to be disrespectful. And I look at them as well because, in particular, some of the texts have a lot of background that's really useful because, again, like I said, Parashara didn't explain anything. And a lot of the texts, not including Parashara, were written by astrologers of the day, of India, who saw a lot of charts, and they're writing down their explanations of how these things work, and it's based on myth and all kinds of interesting stuff. In particular, as it relates to things like the nodes, which Parashara didn't really write very much about. You also have other texts that refer to things like, for instance, in the that have to do with nakshatras, because there's not a lot about the nakshatras in Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra. So you go to texts like Muhurta Chintamani and Kala Prakashika and other texts that fill in those gaps. But when we're talking about Parashara type astrology, which is what most people are doing, that's the text to really look at. So again, this is another reason why, as I said, you don't see me chasing 100 other principles, because if you can go into the 15 or 20 really important things organized in the right way with the right priority. And again, there are things that I haven't mentioned in this quick video, like, the retrograde motion, what that actually means. The difference between the planet as a karaka, what forms yogas, the houses the planets rule, the deep nature of all those houses and how they're different than every other house. All of that stuff that seems like, oh, well, that's just all the basics. Planet, signs, houses, that's just the basics. There's nothing basic about it. All of that is built on the deepest principles. And I can almost guarantee that most people don't know it, unless they've spent an exhaustive amount of time going through and drilling out and bringing out all of that power. And this is the main thrust of Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra. And again, even including things like aspects and how to calculate the aspects, what the aspects really mean, how they really work. And again, this helps you avoid things that don't make sense, like, Rahu and Ketu casting aspects, which really makes no sense when you look at what the Graha Drishti is. Now, they can give Rashi aspects because they occupy a Rashi, but that's different than a Graha Drishti. This idea that Rahu and Ketu cast 5th and 9th house aspects, it's nowhere in Parashara, and it doesn't make sense anyway. And it's not even controversial. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But focusing on Brihat, Parashara, Hora Sastra, very important to understanding really the genesis of how these Vedic concepts turned into astrology. So I'm going to continue with other videos that explain this in more depth and what exactly these principles are and how they work together and how they're supposed to be organized. So I hope this was helpful.